I. I was 11 and my sister was 9, and we were in that house for 6 weeks in the fall of 2009, and I want to say at the front that nothing happened in it after that morning. Not one thing. I. I want that on the record because I know how these stories are supposed to go, and mine doesn't go that way. And it's the reason I've never been able to set it down. We were building. My father had bought 3 acres off my uncle up Beech Fork in Braxton County, and they'd cleared it that spring and the framing was up by August, but the well came in bad and everything stalled. We were out of our rental on the 1st of October with nowhere to go. So my grandmother made a phone call. There was a woman she'd known since Bible school, Audie Skidmore, who had a house up the same run about 1.5 miles above our lot. And Audie had gone into an assisted place in Sutton the year before, and the house was sitting there full of furniture with nobody in it. Family said, use it. My mother cleaned it for 2 days before we moved a thing. That house was old. Not old like a farmhouse from the 20s, old. My father guessed 1880s, and I've since seen a deed reference that puts a structure on that ground in 1877. 2 stories, and the whole thing was built out of what the mountain gave them. Which means the framing was chestnut, and the interior walls were plaster over split lath, and the floors were pine boards a foot wide. There was no insulation anywhere in it, none. The walls of that house were plaster, an air cavity, and more plaster. And I need you to hold on to that because it's the entire mechanical fact underneath everything I'm about to tell you. The position of it was this. About 400 yards up a dirt track off the county road, on a bench of ground with the run below and the mountain coming up hard behind. No other house in sight. The nearest was the Wilfongs a half-mile down and around the shoulder, and they were in their 80s, and I don't think either of them heard well. We had the upstairs. There were 3 rooms up there. My parents' room at the front, a little box room with the stairs, and the back bedroom, which is where my sister and I went. There was 1 bed in it. An iron one with a mattress that Audie Skidmore had probably slept on for 50 years, and there was no way we were sleeping apart in a strange house anyway, so we shared it. Here's the geometry. And I've drawn it out for people about 40 times, because it's the only thing that matters. Our bed was against the west wall of the back bedroom. My parents' bed in the front room was against the east wall of that room. It was the same wall. 1 partition, maybe 6 inches thick, plaster and lath and dead air, and our headboards were on opposite sides of it, probably not 4 feet apart if you measured through. And that wall talked. That's the first thing we discovered, and it delighted us. You could hear everything through it. You could hear my father cough, you could hear the springs. You could hear my mother say something at a normal volume and make out most of the words. And within about 2 nights, my sister and I had a whole system going, which is that we'd knock, 3 knocks on the plaster and you'd get 3 back. That was good night. My mother started it, actually, the second night, and it became a thing. And my father grumbled about it and did it anyway. I want to make sure that's clear. This was not something the house was doing. This was a game the 4 of us invented in that house in the first week of October, and it did not exist anywhere else in the world. Now, the morning. It was a Saturday in the middle of the month. I know it was a Saturday because there was no school, and because of what my parents were doing, which I'll get to. My sister and I had come up hard out of sleep the way you do when a sound gets into a dream first, and the sound was knocking on the wall, not 3. That's the thing I've never been able to get past, and I want to lay it out slowly. It was in 3s, but it kept going. 3 and a pause, and 3 and a pause, and 3 again, patient, evenly spaced. At about the height a person's hand would be if they were lying in a bed on the other side. Not loud, not banging. The exact volume you'd use if you were being playful with somebody 4 feet away through a partition. And we knocked back. Of course we did. We were 11 and 9, and it was morning, and we were giggling before we were fully awake, and my sister did a whole rhythm, shave and a haircut, and it answered. Not the same rhythm. It went back to 3s. 3. I want to say that I remember the light in that room, which was gray and cold, because it faced the mountain and never got sun until 11, and I remember the smell of that house, which was old plaster and mothballs and wood smoke that had been in the boards for 130 years. We did that for, I don't know, 2 minutes? Longer than you'd think. My sister says 5, and I say 2, and the truth is neither of us knows. And then we got up to go say good morning, and we went down that little hall, and my parents' door was standing open and their bed was made. Not empty, made. Quilt pulled up, pillows squared, the way my mother did every single day of her life. And I stood in that doorway, and I looked at that made bed against that wall, and something in the middle of my chest went cold and stayed cold. I and my sister said, "Where are they?" in an ordinary voice, because she hadn't gotten there yet. I went and got my phone. I had a hand-me-down flip phone that I'd had for about 4 months, and I was extremely proud of it. And there was one bar in the upstairs hall of that house and nowhere else on the property. And I texted my mother, where she called me back inside of a minute. Which I've since understood is what a mother does when her 11-year-old texts her at 8 in the morning. They were at the Kroger in Sutton, 15 miles. They'd left before 7 because my father wanted to be at the lumber yard when it opened, and they'd decided to do the week's shopping while they were down. And they'd looked in on us, and we were asleep, and they hadn't wanted to wake us. And my mother had left a note on the kitchen table that neither of us had gotten far enough downstairs to see. I asked her, and I remember doing this in a very small voice. I asked her if she'd come back and knocked on the wall. She said, "What?" And I told her. And she said, "We dreamed it." And I said, "Both of us." And she went quiet. Then she said they'd be home in half an hour and to go downstairs and wait on the porch. And that's exactly what we did. 2 kids in pajamas on the front porch of an 1880s house on a bench of ground up a dirt track in October. Sitting on the steps with our feet in the wet grass until we heard that truck come up the run. Now here's the 2,200-word version of the part that everybody skips to. And I'm going to be honest about it because being honest about it is the only reason I still tell this. There is an explanation, and it's a good one, and I've spent 16 years inside it. That house had steam heat, a coal boiler converted to oil sometime in the 60s, with big cast iron radiators, and there was a riser going up through that partition wall to feed the front room. And a steam or hot water riser in an old wall does exactly this. It expands when it heats, it drags against the framing, and it knocks. It's called water hammer or pipe knock, and it is one of the most common sounds in old houses in this country, and it goes in irregular runs of 2 and 3 and 4, with pauses between. I and my father, who spent 31 years as a millwright and knew more about pipe than any man I've met, went up there that afternoon and put his hand on the wall and told us that's what it was. And the timing works. The thermostat was downstairs, and it kicked in the morning when the house dropped, and my parents had left at 7 and the sun hadn't come on that side. So the boiler firing at 8 in the morning in the middle of October is not just plausible, it's expected. I have said all of that to myself 10,000 times, and most days it's enough. Here's what it doesn't touch. And there's only one thing, and it's small, it answered. That's all. That's the whole of it. It wasn't the knocking. The knocking has a name and a mechanism, and I accept it. It's that my sister knocked shaving a haircut, 7 beats. And there was a pause of about the length the person takes to think, and then it came back with 3. A pipe cannot wait for you to finish. And I have gone at that from every direction a person can. Coincidence? And I'll allow that a thermal event could land in a gap by chance and did probably 4 or 5 times over those 2 minutes. Confirmation? And I'll allow that 2 children in a dim room are the least reliable witnesses on earth, and that we wanted it to be our parents so badly that we'd have heard an answer in a bird. My sister is 33 now, and she's a physician's assistant in Morgantown, and she is not a woman who indulges in anything. And when I brought this up at Thanksgiving in 2019, she said it answered. And then she said, and I know that's not possible. And then she asked if there was more dressing. We were in that house 5 more weeks. Nothing. Not a sound, not a shadow, not one thing. We slept in that bed 20 more nights and knocked our 3 knocks at my mother every one of them, and got 3 back from the actual human being on the other side of that wall. And then the well came in, and we moved into the new house in November. And I don't think I thought about it again until I was 17. Audie Skidmore died in 2013. She was 94. The house went to a nephew who rented it to a series of people and then let it go. And the last time I drove up that run, 3 summers ago, with my own daughter in the back seat, because I wanted to see the ground. The roof was through on the back corner, and there was a poplar coming up out of the porch. I stopped. I stood at the bottom of that track for a while. And what I was thinking about isn't the wall. It's my mother, because when I asked her on the phone that morning whether she'd come back and knock, she went quiet. And I've replayed that silence for 16 years. It was not a confused silence. It was about 4 seconds long, and it had something in it. And when she started talking again, she was brisk, and she told us to go outside and sit on the porch. Which is a very specific instruction to give 2 children about a house you've just put them in. I asked her about it once in 2017, and she said she didn't remember any of it, but she did the thing people do. She said that old house had pipes in it before I'd finished the question. Before I'd said knocking, before I'd said wall, before I'd said one single word about what I was asking. She had the answer loaded, and she'd been carrying it a long while, and I have never been able to work out whether that means my mother knew something about that house that she wasn't going to hand to her children, or whether it just means she'd spent 16 years doing exactly what I've been doing, lying in the dark with an explanation she wants to be true, waiting on somebody to bring it up so she can say it out loud again and see if it holds. I've been in construction since 1988, and I've torn down, I'd estimate, somewhere north of 90 structures. Houses, barns, a church in Braxton County, 2 schools, a motel out on Route 19 that took 3 days. Demolition is a big part of what a small contractor does in this state, because there's more old building than there is new money. And the fastest way to get a lot ready is to put the dozer to what's on it. So I've been in a lot of houses in the last minute of their lives. I say that because I need you to understand that I'm not somebody who gets spooky about buildings. I've pulled apart houses with people's wedding pictures still on the walls. I found a locked bedroom with a crib in it that hadn't been opened in 30 years, in Roane County. I got in there with a pry bar, and I hauled the crib out to the dumpster, and I ate my lunch after. That's the job. You don't feel about it. If you felt about it, you couldn't do it. Because every single one of those houses was somebody's whole life, and there's 100 of them in every county, and they all have to come down eventually. The lot was up Hominy Creek in Nicholas County, off the Muddlety side. I bought it in the spring of 2011 at a delinquent tax sale for less than the price of the excavator's trailer tires. 0.4 of an acre. There were 3 structures on it, a small frame house, maybe 800 square feet, 1.5 stories with a shed dormer somebody had added badly. Behind it, a chicken house. And behind that, something that had been a smokehouse or a spring house, I never worked out which. 12 by 12, half sunk into the bank. The house had been vacant a long time. You can tell how long by what's growing out of it. There was a poplar coming up through the back corner of that porch that was 6 inches at the butt, which put you at 15 years easy, and the gutters had trees in them. And the whole north side had gone green with moss to the roof line, because that lot sat down in the run and never got sun before 10. That's the geography of the whole thing, and it's why I've never quite been able to leave it alone. That house was in a hole. The mountain came up on 2 sides of it, and there was one neighbor up the road about 80 yards on the high side, and past that nothing but timber for a good long way. Inside, it was what they always are. Somebody had been through it. Not vandals, but the family, or somebody's idea of the family. And they'd taken the obvious things and left everything else. Furniture still in place. A chifforobe. Canning jars in the cellar, hundreds of them. Mostly empty. Wallpaper in 3 layers coming off in sheets. A calendar on the kitchen wall from 2001 with a picture of a covered bridge on it. And the days marked off with an X through the 11th of some month, and then nothing after. I want to be honest that I didn't look at any of it very hard. I walked it once for asbestos and copper, and then I didn't go back in. We started on a Thursday in May, me and a fellow named Cody who worked for me off and on, 24 years old, good hand with a machine and not much of a talker. I was in the dozer, a D5, older than he was, and he was running a skid steer, loading debris into a 30-yard roll-off we'd set on the roadside. I took the chicken house and the spring house first because they were nothing. Half an hour, both of them, and they went into the box in about 8 scoops. Then the house. You start at a corner. You don't just drive into the middle of a structure because you don't know what's holding what. So you take a corner and you let it fold. And then you work the pile. I came in on the southeast corner at about 10 in the morning, and I put that blade through the porch and the front wall, and about a third of that little house came down at once. And the dust that comes off a 100-year-old house is a particular thing. Plaster dust and coal soot, and horsehair and whatever's been living in the walls, and it hangs in the air a long time when there's no wind. I backed off and let it clear, and I went in again. Second pass took the front room and the stairs, and on the third pass, out the left side of my vision, and I want to be careful here, because everything about this is in that peripheral zone, and I know exactly what that's worth. There was a woman on the ground beside the tracks, close, 8 or 10 feet off the machine, which is inside the distance where I should not have been able to see her without having seen her come. She was small, and she was old, and she had on a dress that came down to her ankles, dark, printed, the kind of dress that was already old-fashioned when my grandmother wore one. And she had something on her head. I've said bonnet for 14 years because that's the closest word I've got. And what I actually mean is a head covering with a bit of brim to it, the sort of thing a woman puts on to go out and hoe. And she had a stick in her right hand, not a cane. She wasn't leaning on it, she had it up, out from her body, the way you'd hold a stick you were fixing to use, and she was hollering at me. Here's the thing about being in a dozer. You've got a diesel engine 3 feet behind your head and steel tracks on gravel and a blade full of broken house, and you can't hear a shotgun. I've had men stand off my blade and wave both arms and yell for a minute before I've registered them. So I did not hear one word of what that woman said. I heard nothing. What I saw was her face doing what a face does when a person is shouting, and I saw her mouth make a shape, and I have always been sure, completely sure, and I know how much a memory is worth after 14 years, that what she was saying was, "What are you doing to my house?" I put the blade down and killed the engine. That takes a few seconds. You drop the blade, you idle it down. You turn the key, and there's a period where the engine winds out and the noise falls away, and then it's quiet, and it was quiet. The way that lot always was, down in that run with the mountain on 2 sides. I could hear the skids steer up at the road, and I could hear the water, and that was it. I climbed down the left side, which put me right where she'd been standing, and there was nobody there. Now, I want to walk through what I did next, because it's what a contractor does and not what a person in a story does. I walked the perimeter of the pile. I looked in the roll-off and behind it. I walked up the drive to the road and looked both ways. I went around the back and up the bank a little, because if she'd come down off the mountainside, that's where she'd have gone. I checked the ground. The whole lot was soft that week. We'd had rain Tuesday, and I had track marks and boot prints everywhere, and I did not find one print I couldn't account for, and I looked hard, because I've done enough job site injuries to know what happens if you find somebody under a pile at 4 o'clock. And I asked Cody. I walked up to the road and I said, "Did you see a woman come down there?" And he said no. He'd been facing the box, loading, and he'd have had his back to the drive for most of that, so that's not much. But he also hadn't seen a vehicle. And the only way onto that lot other than the road is straight up a mountain through Greenbrier. I got back on the dozer. I want to be honest about that too. I sat there about 10 minutes with the key in my hand, and then I started it. And I finished that house, and I was done at 3. And I have thought about those 10 minutes a great deal because I don't know what happened in them. Here's the neighbor, fellow named Kermit Bays, 70-some. Lived up the road on the high side, and he'd been down to look at the machines twice already because that's what men that age do. He came down again about 4 while we were sweeping the lot with the loader bucket. And we got to talking, and I told him. I don't know why I did. I hadn't planned on telling anybody, and I've never been the sort to. And he listened, and he did not laugh, and when I got to the dress, he said, "Was there anything on her head?" I said yes, and he said, "Did she have a stick?" That's not me remembering it charitably. That's the order he asked it in, and it was 2 questions, and he asked them both before I described either thing. Her name was Nova Bays, his cousin, some degree removed, which is how everything works up there. She'd lived in that house from about 1950 until she died, in it in December of 2001, at 84 years old. He said she'd been born a mile up that same run. He said she went out in that dress every day of her life, and she carried a stick because of the copperheads and because of dogs. And he said she used it on both. And then he said the thing that has stayed in me for 14 years. And he said it standing in a lot with a bulldozer and a dumpster and a bare rectangle of dirt where a house had been that morning. He said she wouldn't have wanted that. And I said, "Wanted what?" And he pointed at the ground. He said she'd told him more than once that she meant to be buried on that lot, up against the bank behind the spring house, and that the family had put her at the Methodist Cemetery in Somersville instead because of the law. And she'd made an issue of it while she was living. And she'd made everybody uncomfortable about it. And after she went, nobody honored it because you can't. And then he said his cousin's boy had inherited it and never come. And the taxes had gone. And here I was. I'll give you the explanations because I've used everyone. I was 51 years old. I'd been in that seat since 7 in the morning. There was plaster dust in the air thick enough to taste. And my visibility on the left side of that machine was poor with the blade up. Dust and light and a fatigued man's peripheral vision will build a person out of a fence post. That is well documented, and I've had it happen twice since, both times a mailbox. And I'd walked through that house in April, and I'd seen a chifforobe and a calendar, and God knows what else. And there is no telling what my mind had already assembled about who lived there without ever telling me it had. That's the honest version, and I believe it about 4 days out of 7. But here's what I can't get around, and it's not the woman, and it's not Kermit Bays knowing about the stick at the It's that I have taken down 90-some buildings, and I have never seen anything, before or since, on any of them. Not once. Not in a church, not in a school, not in a house with a crib, in a locked room. Just that one. Just a little frame house down in a hole on Hominy Creek that belonged to a woman who wanted to stay on that ground so badly that she told her people about it and made them uncomfortable, and they told her no. I built the new house. Somebody's living in it right now. I drive past it maybe twice a year, and what I turn over at 2 in the morning isn't whether I saw her, it's the arithmetic of it. Because she died in 2001 and I came in 2011, and I've never been able to work out what she was doing for those 10 years in a house nobody came to. With the poplar coming up through the porch and the gutters growing trees, waiting on somebody, I guess. And then a man showed up with a machine. I ran the same 3 miles for 2.5 years, and I want to lay out that route before anything else, because the route is the whole reason I couldn't talk myself out of it. The gym was in Raynell, Greenbrier County, in a metal building that had been a farm supply, and I went 4 evenings a week after my shift at the plant in Rupert. I'd lift and then I'd run. And the run was always the same because I'm the kind of person who does the same thing. Out the back lot, left on Kanawha, up the hill past the old school, I ride on a street called Bell that runs a quarter-mile and dead ends at a hillside, back down and around again. That's the country you need to picture. Raynell sits down in a bottom with Sewell Mountain on one side and the ridges running up on the other, and the town is maybe 1,500 people, and the streets on the upper end are half empty. The 2016 flood took a lot of houses out of that town, and a lot of them never came back. There are lots up there that are just steps and a foundation and a maple tree, and there are houses standing empty with the doors on them. So a person running that route at 7 in the evening in November is running through a place where about a third of the buildings have nobody in them, with a mountain going up black behind the last row. I started noticing it in the fall of 2019. The first one was on Bell. There was a man walking away from me, maybe 150 yards up, and I registered him the way you register anybody. Jacket, dark pants, walking. And I ran maybe 30 seconds, and I looked up, and he was in the same place, not standing. That's what I need you to hold on to, and it's the thing I have never once been able to describe to anybody's satisfaction. He was walking. Arms going, shoulders rolling, that whole rhythm, and he was not covering ground. It's exactly what a person looks like on a treadmill. And that comparison is so obvious that everybody I've ever told has said like a treadmill back to me before I finish. And yes, like a treadmill. In the middle of a street in Raynell. I remember thinking my own pace had gone to nothing. That's the first thing your mind reaches for, that you're the one who stopped. So I looked down at my feet, and I looked at the mailboxes going past me, and I was running fine. I was doing what I always do, and I looked up again, and he was in the same place and still walking. And then I got closer, and he started moving, just normally. Whatever had been off about it wasn't off anymore. And he walked to the top of Bell, like a man walking to the top of Bell. And I turned around at the dead end about 40 yards behind him and ran back down, and I did not look at him as I passed. And I have never been able to explain to myself why I didn't. I filed it. I want to be honest about that. I filed it under tired, and I had reason to. I was working 10-hour shifts and running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and I'd had a headache most of that month. The second one was in December, and it was a woman. And this is the one that took the ground out from under me. Same street, later, full dark, and Bell has 3 streetlights on it, and one of them has been out since I was in high school. She was up near the top, walking away. And I saw the thing again immediately. The moving, not moving, the arms and the shoulders, and no ground going under her. And I want to tell you that I stopped and observed carefully like a scientist, and I didn't. I kept running. Because if you stop, you have to admit what you're looking at. And she turned the corner, except there is no corner. That is the entire content of this, and it's why I've never let it go. Bell dead ends. There is a hillside at the top of it, and a guardrail, and then greenbrier and second growth going up the ridge. There is no cross street. And she went, I saw her go. To the right at the top, the way you'd round a building. And she was out of my sight for about 8 seconds while I closed the last of that distance. And then I was standing at the top of Bell with my hands on my knees, and there was nothing to the right. There's a lot with a foundation on it, and a maple and a mowed strip, and then the bank. No driveway, no house standing, no fence to get behind. And I had a clear line to the end of it, because there's a light on the pole above that lot, and I could see the whole thing. I looked for about 10 minutes. I went up on that lot. I looked behind the foundation, which is 3 courses of block, knee high, and there's nothing to hide behind about it. I went to the guardrail, and I looked over into the brush, and there was no path. I don't say she couldn't have gone up that bank. A determined person can go up anything. But it's greenbrier, and it makes noise, and there's no way through it that doesn't take a while. And it was 8 seconds. I ran home the long way that night, down through the middle of town where the lights are. The third one was in February, and it was the closest I ever got. There's a gravel drive beside the gym that runs back a good ways to a garage and a couple of outbuildings. And I was coming out the back door about 6:30 with my bag over my shoulder. Not running, just walking to my truck. And there was somebody about 80 feet up that drive in a coat doing it. And I want you to understand the distance. Because 150 yards down a dark street is one thing, and 80 feet under a security light is another. I could see his boots. I could see his boots working. Heel down, roll through, toe off, correct? The whole action, and he was not moving up that drive. Not slowly. Not at all. It was like watching a video that had frozen, except it hadn't frozen because the parts were still going. I stood there. I don't know how long. And I've decided it was probably no more than 15 or 20 seconds, though it felt like a good deal more. And I didn't call out. I've thought about that more than I've thought about any other part of this. And the honest answer is that I did not want him to turn around. I got in my truck. I sat for a minute with the engine going and the heater coming up, and then I did the reasonable thing. Which is I backed out and swung the truck so the headlights went straight up that drive. Nothing. 80 feet of gravel and a closed garage and 2 outbuildings with the doors shut. And I sat there with my high beams on it for probably a minute and a half. Now here's the fair part, and I want to do it properly because I've had 6 years and I'm not stupid. There is a real thing where a distant figure appears not to advance. It's an angle problem. If somebody is walking away from you at a shallow angle, or if the ground is doing something you can't read at that distance, you can lose the sense of their progress entirely. And if you're moving toward them at the same time, the geometry gets worse, not better. I've read about it since. Sailors have a version of it. Pilots have a version of it. It's ordinary and it's well documented, and I'll take it for the first one on Bell without any argument at all. And I was tired, and it was dark. And Raynell in winter at 7 in the evening is a town where half the light comes from 3 street lamps and a mountain eats the rest. And the woman at the dead end, she could have gone up that bank. Or into a lot I've misremembered the shape of. 6 years is a long time, and memory is a reconstruction, and I know exactly what my own account is worth. But the drive by the gym was 80 feet under a light. I have never been able to make the angle explanation touch it, because there was no angle. He was straight up that drive from me, and I could see his boots working. Here's the piece I don't tell often. There's a fellow named Denver who worked at the plant with me, 60-some, born and raised in that town. And I asked him one night in the break room in a roundabout way whether he'd ever heard of anything odd on the upper end. Didn't say what, just asked. And he took a while, and then he said his mother wouldn't walk Bell after dark her whole life, and that when he was a boy she told him people got turned around up there. And that's the phrase she used, turned around, and she wouldn't be pressed past that. And he said he'd always thought it was about the mines. That there's works under that whole hillside from the 20s and 30s, and nobody has a good map of them, and that the ground on the upper end of that town is not what people think it is. I don't know what to do with that. I've never known. It's not an explanation of anything. It's just an old woman's rule and a man's guess about why she had it. I stopped running that route in the spring of 2020, and I'd like to tell you it was because of this. But it was the plant going to 12-hour shifts, and then it was everything else that spring. I run on a treadmill in my basement now, which my wife thinks is funny, and I have never told her the reason, and I'm not going to. And here's what I turn over at 2 in the morning, and it isn't the disappearing, and it isn't the woman at the dead end. What is that all 3 of them were walking away from me, everyone. I never saw one coming toward me, not once. I ran that route 4 evenings a week for 2.5 years. They were always up ahead, always with their backs to me, always doing that thing. And the thing they were doing, if you strip everything else out of it, is trying to leave, arms going, boots working, everything a body does to get somewhere, and not one of them ever got anywhere, until I came close enough to see, and then they did.